Hi everyone. Today we'll be doing one thing and one thing only, which is reading my current essay, Horrors, Heart Attacks, and Those Who Cause Them. But before we get to that, a little bit about me. My name's Persephone Vanderwaard. I have my MA in Gothic English Literature and Indian PhD in Gothic Poetics and Ludo-Gothic BDSM, focusing partially on Metroidvania, and I am the author of the multi-volume nonprofit book series Sex Positivity. Its art director, sole invigilator, illustrator, and primary editor, the other co-writer, co-editor being Bay Ryan. I'm a male-to-female trans woman, Tolkien and Amazon enthusiast, anti-fascist, atheist and Satanist, polypan kinkster, erotic artist, pornographer, and anarcho-communist. Originally, this blog explored my love of movies when I was cishet. Now I use it to write about the gothic, horror, but also sex, heavy metal, and video games in a queer way, especially Metroidvania. You can financially support my blog through Ko-fi or Patreon. One is safe for work, and the other not safe for work, but the money for either goes towards the same art and essays I produce, which often complement each other. Also, before we proceed, this essay essentially functions as a script. We'll be reading it from top to bottom, and while I have practiced reading it, I will undoubtedly make some small mistakes, hopefully not many, and hopefully the ones I do make are small, but I will not be editing this to make it sound like I'm reading this perfectly without zero mistakes. Also, as we read from top to bottom, I will be pausing to look at visual aids and read footnotes as we come across them. Without further ado, let's get started. This essay, Joy Under Fascism, was written to find joy under fascism, i.e. while responding to a scholar whose book I found in a used bookshop after a health scare. Jill Suzanne Smith's Berlin Coquette on sex work also applies to Amazon's and my Metroidvania work. It remains part of my sex positivity series, albeit coming from outside the books themselves, i.e. belonging to a disparate body of essays and interviews that fall under the same basic umbrella, but often will engage with more than the usual suspects, someone who vocally disagrees with us in times of state, even planetary crisis, and with whom various members of the Sex Positivity Project make themselves heard. Note, this essay is actually part of my 2025 Metroidvania corpus, specifically thinking about horrors and violence and their depiction in and out of media, e.g. my acquisition of old books at used bookstores and synthesizing them years later in light of crisis, health scares, and fresh love. Said essay is written to be as safe for work as possible, but where this blog and the YouTube version will be more censored than on my 18 and up website. For the visually impaired, I will also be reading the Safe for Work version aloud on my YouTube channel, which is what this video is. Disclaimer regarding essay contents. This essay is non-profit and provided for purposes of education, critique, and satire, i.e. is a matter of professional opinion against multiple other public figures and publicly available material during times of state crisis. Content warning: classism, racism, sexual assault, transphobia, whorephobia, fascism, aporophobia, police brutality, and genocide. Amazon Postscript, mini-essay for funsies, Horrors, Heart Attacks, and Those Who Cause Them, or Reversing Objection to Find Joy Under Fascism, featuring Scotty C.W., Jill Suzanne Smith, and more. For the past week, I found myself undergoing a health scare, specifically one surrounding my heart. The events that followed led me to writing this essay. Given its topic, I chose to include it in my corpus, a brief glimpse into the critical engagement side of things, i.e. which my corpus largely avoids for brevity's sake, but whose mentioning here feels increasingly important to me in light of recent political change, i.e. fascism, but also my unyielding resolution to combat fascism day and night, through joyful, slutty, and ravenously hungry monstrous feminine nudity, GNC self-expression laid bare, alongside other marginalities. Death comes for us all, is always just around the corner, but especially while capital accelerates the process for profit mid-abjection. Consider me recharged at learning that I won't be dropping dead this instant, but also knowing I can have my revenge against capital a bit longer. However bonkers that may be, silly serious, as the Gothic generally is, know the attempt was at least genuine, a field guide for surviving fascism as historically diehard. Persephone, 7/10/2025. P.S. In the Gothic tradition of found documents, especially derelict documents, open secrets, this essay focuses on a 2013 book I found in a used bookshop by accident, Berlin Coquette, by Jill Suzanne Smith. And perhaps Smith went on to write really cool stuff, i.e. that's more gender inclusive than her 2013 book, but specifically its introduction. In that vein, I'm essentially arguing with her ghost, a sensation not entirely unheard of in academia, e.g. Weber versus Marx, but also a fragment of said ghost. My selective reading, an academic standby when time is short, should highlight her book's flaws, insofar as her introduction sums up her book. To it, my problem with Smith lies in her premise, furthering objection, not individual problems sprinkled throughout. Postscript. This particular essay contains censored nudity whose contents remains erotic, e.g. me above, i.e. of workers having sex or otherwise doing sex work for educational purposes. Depending on the platform, this nudity will be more censored or less. Jouissance can be described as joy with an intellectual but also orgasmic heft. Being a trans sex worker academic, I experienced joy while fighting fascism, i.e. by reversing Kristeva's process of abjection, us versus them, generally in monstrous Gothic language mid-cryptonymy, itself a term lifted from Hogel's The Restless Labyrinth, cryptonymy in the Gothic novel. But it's not always healthy. Revolution demands sacrifice, curing poison with poison, rape with rape, on a historical material scale using dialectical material arguments, the dualistic, half-real poetry of monstrous theater for ass war, class war via sex work, with cultural and racial considerations, raising intelligence and awareness to prevent rape, thus genocide on a systemic level, re Little Gothic BDSM, targeting a bourgeois superstructure for proletarian purposes. This essay will explore doing potentially unhealthy things to combat absolutely unhealthy things, the joy under fascism being paradoxical nudity to reverse abjection before the killing fully starts, i.e., using the very monstrous language known to whores that some academics tacitly reject, e.g. Jill Suzanne Smith, the foil for this current adventure as I give Capital a heart attack, by unmasking the whore before it's too late, not to punish her by outing her to police forces Radcliffe style, but wake Medusa up to punch up collectively at Capital pimping workers in nature as monstrous feminine, to cheapen them, but also their exploitation, Ari Patel and more. Sleep is the cousin of death, and death and love only enmesh further when the wolf is loose. Some context. Let it never be said that fascism is good for you, nor is fighting it a wholly salubrious ordeal. On the 4th of July weekend, I suddenly fell ill, mild spontaneous tachycardia. Concerned, I chose not to suffer in silence, but reach out to a local partner for help. Part of that was logistics, but also a holiday from the stress of work that was making me sick. In short, they helped me, Miss Workaholic, take an impromptu vacation. Stress is cardiotoxic, they said, to which my inner gothicist readily concurred, e.g. thinking of the plot to Les Diaboliques, but also Dr. Zhivago, depicting love and death as kissing cousins. During my break, we went to a used bookstore, my partner's idea. There I found several books that caught my eye, leading me to write this essay. This is an image from Dr. Zhivago where, upon seeing his old lover walking past him while he is on the train, he gets off the train and is so excited by the sight of her, having not seen him, that he dies of a heart attack. For you youngsters who have never been to an actual bookstore, used or otherwise, the process is rather stochastic. The serendipitous delight one feels when finding a good book, essentially involving whatever catches one's eye. This ocular process of selection has served me well in the past when picking out books with different partners. See Exhibit 1 below. or picking out partners who, once chosen, might lead to various adventures that include books, sex, books about sex, monsters, and so on. A good partner and a good book often go hand in hand, and monsters are often sexual in nature or discuss things that are made objection, e.g., communism, the devil, and sex workers being regular suspects under capitalism. Exhibit 1. 2 different used bookstores, 2 different partners who bought me books after grad school, with various adventures tied to each, e.g. the styrofoam containers in the takeout bag from the second bookstore, bottom right, accidentally overturned, spilling their contents into the bag and causing it to leak, and forcing me to throw out the food, much to my chagrin. Deprived of prandial food thanks to my own absent-mindedness, I fed my mind on the usual foodstuffs academics often resort to, a house of leaves. Furthermore, when writing this section, I took my copy of George Moss's Nationalism and Sexuality that Jadis bought me in 2022, the rightmost book, bottom left, and combined it alongside my examining of a different book, R.A. Jill Smith's Berlin Coquette, that a newer partner purchased for me in a completely different city and state 3 years later. The exact books and their respective acquisitions led me to reading a bit while at the hospital and gave me food for thought about my own work in relation to other workers, e.g. Smith's Berlin Coquette as something to synthesize, i.e., and the aforementioned old-fashioned way of looking at something and going from there, or from grad school onwards, leasing the approach from my pre-internet past as a little girl reading books from the local library in my spare time. Books are brain food. I see food, I eat it, with people being food as much as books, as are all the assorted neo-medieval hyphenations Gothic typically affords. This time I read Smith's concept of a whore's ball, i.e. as advertised by West Berlin media in 1988, but also her academic desire to view whores in ways that defy common expectations about whores. Quote, "What will the world come to if we can no longer tell who's a whore and who isn't?" R.E. The objection process. This book is much like The Whore's Ball, for it provides its readers with images of prostitutes in Berlin that defy common stereotypes about deviance and destitution. It does so, however, by examining debates on prostitution that took place up to a century before the women of Hydra organized their first ball. Some artists and writers who lived and worked in the German capital at the time were able to see beyond dichotomized images of prostitutes and envision them as something other than victims or villains. Granted, some of Berlin's most iconic cultural texts serve up visions of female monstrosity and victimization that are impossible to erase from our indexed. Without ignoring these images of Berlin's metropolitan decadence and sexual murder, this book shows the idea of prostitutes as rational workers and as elegant bourgeois coquettes, cocotten, also surfaced and took hold during this period and give us a far more complex, differentiated picture of gender and sexuality in modern Berlin. My work disrupts the dichotomized reading of prostitutes as either victims or agents of destruction reproduced in existing scholarship, R.E. Creed's The Monstrous Feminine, which, much like the Taz's article about the whore's ball, perpetuates stereotypes of prostitutes and produces narratives laden with judgment that do an injustice to the very context they are describing. Analyses that view prostitution only through the restrictive dual lens of destitution and sexual deviance lead to less nuanced readings of primary sources." Unquote. Introduction to Berlin Coquette. And yet, in reading it, I suddenly felt personally attacked, i.e. by a fellow academic woman discounting my profession and research ideas, i.e. not just Metroidvania, but the Gothic, Monstrous Feminine, Little Gothic BDSM, and public nudism, exhibiting sex and force. An explanation eluded me, save that I wanted to lash out at this stuffy German prude. Bitch, please. In hindsight, I will now follow up with, to Smith and her argument in particular, there's nothing simple about the virgin whore stereotypes you reject as vulgar. As far as worker emancipation goes, taboos yield far more power than you acknowledge, and which playing with them unlocks. By refusing to, you show your privilege and your ass. Your argument's stunning ignorance whitewashing prostitution by discarding Medusa's ancient paradoxical utility. R.E. Creed, her terrifying powers. For the worse, consider my rebuke, however bombastic and biased it may be, a Gorgon's imprimatur, a smaller vessel for gargantuan force. By discounting the victim's villain's binary known to whores, you also reject the cops and robbers' reality, that whores endlessly suffer under capital. Imagine a coder who refuses to code switch, and we have the right idea. We can't critique capital without these codes, so shutting them down is a mistake. Can our enemies fetishize them to serve profit? Sure. But that blade cuts both ways, affording the whore her usual duality and paradox, i.e., which workers can reclaim in ways your bourgeois coquettes demonstrably could not. Hot take, they abandon their ancient power for petty concessions that cost them dearly, and will cost you dearly as fascism comes home anew. I digress. Reading Smith's words, I found myself, a trans-Gothic whore, kinkster, and academic, incredibly ambivalent, so much so that the prior engagement compelled me to write what follows. Academics live to piss each other off, much of what we produce born out of fierce disagreement. To unpack Smith's needlessly complicated seesaw nuance and at times negligent messages in ways I didn't want to wholly dismiss, it was dubious on its face, but still had a few nuggets of truth worth exploring, which we'll get to. All the same, to reject the dichotomy Smith describes is to admit the alien entirely versus embracing it to reverse abjection, mating porcupines. Smith's argument avoids reversal, thus furthers abjection ipso facto, i.e., she falls silent to a moderate degree, regardless of what she says, and silence is genocide, which I want to critique here, by taking her to task while finding joy under fascism as a shared goal from convergent, at times diverging perspectives, concerning whores and Metroidvania in my case. It requires universal liberation through intersectional solidarity, and that is certainly nothing new. Whores are the Medusa, and they must scream one and all through the power of nude uproar versus state crimes, ergo profit. This piece being called The Raft of the Medusa. We'll revisit Smith in a moment. Safe to say here that she effectively blames not just the Gothic and non-female, non-white whores, but also naked whores, i.e. as irrational versus clothed, thinking and paid, whitewashing Berlin in the process. I would respond that whores, and any viewing them through a monstrous feminine emphasis, don't spread stereotypes about prostitution so much as deliberately reuse stereotypical virgin whore language common to sex workers, i.e. in ways state powers rely on through archetypes abused and or overlooked. By choosy activism and scholarship, afraid of gender trouble, but also monsters in naked bodies home to stereotypes enforced by capital. Ignorance is a luxury. Furthermore, whores are monsters, which we shouldn't erase by saying that playing with them is somehow reducing women, or those treated like women, to capital's usual punching bags, so-called theater phobias rejecting satirical value for abstinence. Those who police clothes further objection, promoting genocide and sexual harm, no matter how clothed someone is. Just ask the Weimar women after 1933. Capital chattelizes workers differently, but most of them died anyways. We must fuck with stereotypes to combat their canonically taboo nature, e.g. whores are bastions of distress that make men weak, stray, and so on, re. original sin. The problem is, Smith's moderate whore tokenism includes rejecting said stereotypes to a matter of segregative degree versus embracing and reclaiming them, with Smith essentially saying to her readers, we're not like those whores over there. We're fancy whores that don't look like a whore. Re. their troubling emphasis on bourgeois as A. anything positive, and B. a misunderstanding of bourgeois by treating it as middle class instead of owner class, re. from Marx. It feels oddly reductive and assimilative, an effect easily imitated on various registers, e.g. with video games and performance art, next page, as having its own neoliberal caste character that echoes Smith's subtle castration, i.e. of rebellion, through performative assimilation, flirting with capital, thus fascism, the bougie, classy kind of slut, which, despite its evolution from Marie Antoinette to Paris Hilton, all workers are sexualized, not even when technically whores, feels profoundly inadequate, and, among other things, aporophobic, a castration of radical sentiment through made-it vibes, workers, thus whores, no longer. Sex work is work, paid or not, clothed or not, survival or not. Telling whores to cover up is the oldest refrain there is, one survival sex work bears the brunt of. All the while, research is a highly selective act, one where Smith chooses a very particular kind of horror to write about, and gushing about them while she does in her acknowledgments. White, urbane, female and gentrified, but also dressed, European, Germanic, and paid. Her capital gentrification always follows with immediate, ruthless decay, killing respectability to rape the wife/whore, clothes or not. Segregation is no defense, all workers victim to different degrees, where the outcome is always ruin. Exhibit 2. Steven Chavez's The First Street Fighter 6 man in cosplay we've ever seen is absolutely beautiful, receives attention from the game's director. Artist Kitty Kaboom. Nonetheless, horrors remain cryptomimetic in their usage, e.g. books are copies and horrors copy each other, one whose dualistic exploitation and liberation occupy the same stages, i.e. operating in ways that sexual activism can subvert against the usual pimpings. Gothic communism relies on action for universal liberation, using whatever my friends and I can separately and together accomplish that aim, and any omelus, not just Berlin, the omelus paradox being how workers can only transform a given place while inside it, e.g. Metroidvania, a half-real Berlin, Athens or Rome, i.e. assaulted dualistically by barbarians playing at false revels, fascism, and actual rebels taking said barbarity back, communism, on the half-real stages of play where arguments are had. Workers can say one thing and do another, with horrors having historically supported vertical power structures by punching down as well as horizontal ones by punching up. Regardless, we can't rely on academics and their castles to spread the word. We must become fluent in such matters before spreading them in ways useful to our goals. A squadron of stochastic counter-terror, anisotropically reversing abjection, and terror language horrors excel at, and the kind Smith deliberately abjures, if only to a degree. Keeping that in mind, Smith comes across a bit stuffy and classist in my opinion, but also achingly nostalgic for a before time. Stuck in a frozen past versus a plastic one, she fleeces herself while covering up, i.e. by conveying a pick-me mentality, despite various concessions I more or less agree with, e.g., there is no doubt that prostitutes are paradoxical figures, for they can represent both the affirmation and the subversion of social structures. As public women who sell their bodies, in a market dominated by male buyers, prostitutes seem to reinforce patriarchal capitalism, yet they can also be seen as exploited workers and potential revolutionaries. RE Introduction. She's so close, yet disturbingly myopic, similar to Holocaust media focusing on Jews alone versus the entirety of the victims affected by Western greed run amok, e.g. the Silence Equals Death project from 1987 onwards. The point here is that upon reading Smith et al., I immediately thought of my own approach towards reversing abjection, i.e. as challenging her biological emphasis that furthers abjection, i.e. to stop that by leading into various expectations concerning horrors, deliberately subverting monstrous feminine language to defy the usual benefactors, which includes the middle class. I thus found Smith and I coming at the same problem from vastly different vantage points, and at times cross purposes, her from pre-World War II Berlin, and I from Metroidvania and Amazons, in the present space and time, regarding media orbiting real events that Metroidvania concern on and off stage. Smith, the straight Gen X academic, born in 1972, according to her book, focusing worryingly on women with disturbingly white, cis, and middle-class flavors versus my trans millennials work, born in 1986, expanding the scope of worker liberation to not turn my nose up at such matters, i.e. horrors are monsters of a polity of marginalities, not white German women alone. Furthermore, Gothic shows how history goes beyond real cities, the political reality of trans people and other minorities taking class war, and its cultural and racial intersections to half-real territories, or a Metroidvania in my case, that Smith shies away from, despite the book title, i.e. mostly relegating her analysis to oil paintings, e.g. Kirchner's 1914 Friedrichstreich above. In other words, I found myself altogether intrigued and leery of my discovery, driven both to ruminate on Smith for the duration of my visit, i.e. while staying with my partner at their home, but also elsewhere on my own. In the ER, for example, I found myself eager to jot down my immediate thoughts, RE while being needled by Smith's words in ways that spoke to my own work, punching up at hers. This continued after my holiday ended, my thoughts percolating aggressively while watching a C. Scotty W. world record for Metroid Fusion. I.e., after returning home from my partner's, I began to recall my hospital visit and thoughts I experienced at the time vis-a-vis Smith and my past recent work on Amazons, me being utterly baffled by just how much Smith was omitting in her own discussion on horrors and the Germanic, the Gothic actually being an English creation with German roots, the whole of its scholarship commonly dismissed outright by snobs, and for which I can smell a naysayer a mile away. Medusa is a giantess, the centaur standing in her alien shadow. In short, I was the ideal, if not intended or even target reader of Smith's book, and faced with her problematic arguments while having tackled sex work myself for years, and having written 6 books on the subject regarding monsters, re. It Began with a Whisper, I began to synthesize Smith with C. Scotty W. and all my usual multimedia and gay Gothic ways, the Amazon as warrior whore who induces through sight and other sensations a feeling of intense terror and excitement, inducing extremes worthy of a heart attack, mid-moral panic. She mighty rings a little truer when one is worried about her own heart, especially when she likes Gorgons and Amazons. And I wrote this section a bit under the gun, re. After having spent more time than I like wrestling with intimations of mortality, turning Wordsworth upside down, e.g. I had fucked my partner while thinking about my heart, but also those frisky warrior horrors, the Amazons, and all their usual effects on said heart, regardless of its current symptoms. So, for a bit of extra fun, here's some additional food for thought surrounding all these things. An Oriel window into how my mind usually works mid-research, i.e. while developing Gothic communism using Metroidvania, re. as a holistic liminal process, one, for me, that flows at times through streams of consciousness and vibes with all the usual things I play with, differently than other nerds like Smith do. As a queer nerd, horror junkie, and sex worker who revels in the traditional language of horrors, neglected by Smith's book, my enjoying of Creed's monstrous feminine stems from a numinous, thus transformative, rebellious potential afforded by categorically nude monstrosities, and all horrors are monsters, nude or not. Cognitive dissonance is the point. Lastly, to call it essay might be a tad generous, owing to its conversational nature. Instead, I wrote it for fun while musing on death, and hardly for the first time, re. Facing death, what I learned mastering Metroidvania, essentially serving as a companion piece to go alongside my usual Metroidvania work, weaponizing nudity through Gothic means for different aims, re. States' rights versus worker rights, generally using the same dialectical material language, not psychoanalytical models like Creed does, to further or reverse abjection, thus profit. Profit is abjection, which the horror reverses out of revenge, by finding joy under fascism while doing so. 4 people gonna rise up and get their share. Essay body. While capital needs genocide to function, and fascism is capital decaying by design, marginalized workers feel fascism differently among themselves and sooner than more privileged workers. This essay considers the joy required to survive fascism when it arrives. As it is already here, I want to consider it through the joy I experience regarding horrors, specifically the Gorgons and Amazons of Metroidvania, and how both tie to revolution as a holistic, half-real enterprise reversing abjection. We'll examine Metroid Fusion, Jill Smith, and some of my friends and I, not separately, but part of a larger ongoing equation. To it, I'll have just enough time to lay out the facts, setting the table for future dialogues. Earlier in regarding my Amazon research, I wrote, Samus is a genocidal maniac who kills planets resembling our own. Keeping the above context in mind, I'd like to share some further thoughts, i.e. that emerged while watching C. Scotty W.'s latest Fusion World Record the morning after I returned, re. from my health scare, and after reading Jill Smith. Fusion is a game I greatly enjoyed from my youth, and C. Scotty W. is someone I've interviewed before as an adult, re. Mazes and Labyrinths. Like a heroine in a castle she repeatedly returns to, this essay has me revisiting older points made, and not for the first time. The rest of this essay is what I wrote earlier today, with me effectively commenting on Samus, Scotty, and Smith Per the objection process, the ghost of an ongoing debate, one had by me among our former selves and various left-behinds. It's merely a taste, offering new takes on old things discussed before. Growth happens through repeated challenge, not complacency. To it, Samus is the token Amazon sent to recapitate Medusa, i.e. the female or intersex, non-white, pagan, etc. brain in a jar that once reinstalled or rediscovered by the state inventing her dominion for monomyth slaughter, decapitates her again, all to police her wandering womb for capitalist realism. Recolonizing a given colonial space out of petty state revenge, or denying it, for equally petty motives, to a native population suing for peace, right of return, commonly framed as pirates or pests, but also zombies raped in their sleep during false flags. When nature becomes unruly, thus adverse to exploitation, the state historically retreats from a land they've bombed for profit. In Metroidvania, Samus nukes the planet, but alongside the map she routinely explores, remains haunted by her own crimes and trauma, re mirror syndrome. Objection is abjection. Similar to Rambo, Samus works through stealth and speed, one made or captured by patriarchal authority, re Pygmalion, that's sanctioned for temporary release, parole, speedruns to a given territory to reprime it for present destruction and future repopulation. Re per-settler colonial models with heteronormative and Cartesian elements that scorch the earth, i.e. as completely uninhabitable, reseeding the pariah land's wreckage to bury state secrets and euthanize exile the Amazon as Pavlov's rabid dog, by banishing her post-op to hang the thief, mercenary, and whore as all in one, but also the race car cyborg as conspicuously female, monstrous feminine, and Iron Maiden war bitch. All whores are monsters, but some get notably more attention than others, e.g. white women. The ones Capital hates the most are communist, in which it tokenizes Amazon novelties to destroy while weaponizing themselves during military optimism and insect politics, a waspy parasitoid furthering the Protestant ethic by moving money through nature mid-genocide, re me vis-a-vis Patel and more. To it, Samus is a token cop, thus less expendable than her victims that, when destroyed by the virginal huntress, reflect past betrayals back in her face, i.e. which the state will then blame Samus for mid-objection, reversing Darvo through obscurantism, the entire charade a Promethean structure thereof, and one that preserves their own power by replacing older scapegoats with their killers holding the knife, re engendered monstrous feminine language, e.g. war vaginas and phallic women, archaic mothers, that, all the same, includes Cartesian and settler colonial elements of the whore's abject uncanny revenge, and reversal of said revenge, its explosive unheimlich, spelling out a larger ongoing cycle, unheimlich meaning unhomely or uncanny from Freud, of the monumental power struggles, imbalance, and harm Capital routinely demands, and whose routine shows a forest Metroidvania stage for endless exploration, thus exploitation through lethal fireworks. The state is always hungry and ready to disguise said hunger as home defense. Defense is a lie, space NATO blaming the whore, pointing the finger at herself mid-gaslight. Footnote number 1. Meaning, the Galactic Federation from Metroid, a structure reflected in neoliberal media, video games from Pong onwards. Reactionary or moderate, centrist or fascist, the state must create enemies to fear and destroy while abusing flexible double standards, on stage and off, i.e. amid equally plastic persecution language, assigning in-group and out-group status to uphold the status quo's built-in cops, victims, inequality. It's neoconservative, creating whatever monsters and cops it needs, including whores, policing whores in Metroidvania, good whore, bad whore, Samus, mother brain, survival sex worker, bourgeois coquette. Saber rattling through ceaseless military exercise, and one had by the rat acting the cat inside a giant enclosed cage-like maze. We're left with a fearsome self-hating gargoyle, patrolling home dressed up as elsewhere, and regardless of the form a given destroyer takes, the castle holding it remains a colony to cannibalize repeatedly by the state calling the shots, i.e. advertising rape fears by replacing Samus with a robotically numb, brain-dead, sleepwalker version of herself, She's basically Miss Pac-Man chasing her own ghost. My hungry ass will eat just about anything. So says the elite and those who serve them before skinning their prey, the curious cat, alive, i.e. the state is undead and ravenous. Eventually the procedure becomes Ouroboros, the brothel, a necrotic war zone come home to roost, dead labor feeding on living labor, from Marx to us. Exhibit 3. Source: Jason Rockland's Metroid Dread needs to live up to Fusion's iconic SAX. Fusion's SAX is literally the ghost of Empire, specters of Medusa, Caesar, and Marx, speaking to Samus's former abusers chasing her and the player around, i.e. while she's stripped bare, deprived of the usual armor she enjoys, the eyes and arms of the state hijacked by Imperial victims, and from whose titular Metroid's monster DNA vaccinates Samus from the SAX parasite at a molecular level. 2-way stochastic terrorism, the confusion of non-stop police alarms, levied at a former cop, the ghost of colonizer and colonized occupying, the same concentric, psychomachic, anisotropic, hauntological, and Walpolean suit of armor, castle. The Medusa versus the Amazon, solving for acts on Radcliffe's usual Black Veil Russian dolls, Mise en Abîme. With any Gothic face-off, doubles invite for troubling myriad comparison. To it, there are various interpretations besides the one I gave above, e.g., X equals indigenous revenge versus state revenge, while gazing into death vasovagal. Regardless, class war involves, among many other things also at play, imitation, which unto itself commonly has whores and pimps, occupying the same deathly disguises, often with a mil-spec flavor that sees the cop, outclassed by itself, made alien, i.e. as much as any perceived foe it confuses for itself, made abjection. Such staging is suitably tragic, e.g. like Icarus, Sisyphus, or Prometheus, but also the Gorgon and the Amazon revived in hauntological variants, which Metroidvania are. Like any Gothic heroine, Samus operates under questionable inheritance, i.e. chasing the numinous as dragon to slay on repeat/command. A monomyth, ghost of the counterfeit horror to pimp during mirror syndrome, and one whose flexible, neoliberal triangulation by state powers and their modular persecution networks always have capital playing out in small. A state of exception whose sign of persecution leaps like a hot potato or a virus from victim to victim, including cops who have served their purpose. Living on borrowed time, their FOMO clemency and dependency on state arbitration affords to expendable heroism and mentricidal expectations, proving they aren't the whore by paradoxically walking into a trap, the state of exception, to conduct turf-grade witch hunts, a one where they perform whore-like violence, and violence the state will attach to them as soon as the job, the state's dirty work, is done, re the euthanasia effect, which remains suitably recursive, ergodic, and unmappable during childish invasion fears, a resistance of conquest and liberation tied to fatally nostalgic homes from Radcliffe onwards, a playground of genocide instructed through abjection. Through action as much as space conducive to action, power jumps around, but canonically does so through Metroidvania, e.g. whose state authors tilt the pinball machine to land power in their pockets. As such, the game is both one of play and word games, and whose double standards at play are also temporary and prone to shift during the whore's paradox, camping, rape. Samus is the maiden good whore, space plumber, until she is not, and someone routinely forced to strip armor up and weaponized to prove she is daddy's good girl once more. The preacher's daughter gunning for outsiders, it's only a matter of time before she's exiled again, forcing the cycle to repeat until Ozymandias desiccates the planet. Her turn to be replaced by her own armor is haunted by the usual gloom from Walpole onwards, re Hans Stotz. So does pot meet kettle in a very literal sense, and all well swept up in the usual romance's bellicose gloom, e.g. the infected space station or murky planet underbelly infused with a post-colonial rage made numinously blind, as Medusa classically is, below. Footnote number 2, about Samus being the space plumber. With CIA operatives in Vietnam commonly described as advisors, and military operatives in other wars called contractors, the privatization of war has medieval roots the re-liberalizing of the market under neoliberalism and its cryptonymic power fantasies steadily deregulating a push towards ontologies dialing back worker rights, Samus's power is canonically false. We must reclaim said power by subverting its theft on the Aegis. All the while, the horror is dualistic, working within virgin horror, but also terrorism, counterterrorism, i.e. as something to view and perform, thus interpret during the cryptonomy process, and its liminal ontology of war, furthering or reversing objection. A house under capital is always under arrest, is always alien, meaning through cycles of instability and boom or bust, however is commenting on home as abattoir in disguise. Despite her perceived obedience, then, Samus embodies the Minotaur or Gorgon inside this cycle, making her the central monster as much as Mother Brain, the wicked stepmother or Venus Double, is, full of secrets and pain written on and with stolen goods, wherein she uses her hard-fought material to betray her own female, non-white GNC and or indigenous past again and again, the white savior and Indian, playing an Athena pimping Medusa, but chased by her own shadow Peter Pan style. She must solve Radcliffe's mystery before it's too late, making such stories the girl boss version of Escape from New York, i.e. with touches of Carpenter's 1982 Thing remake, exploring imitation, replacement phobias on colonial frontiers, moving the goalposts using the imperial boomerang. The fact remains, development is dialectical material, less dualistic. My synthesis of Gothic theories yield pro-state and pro-labor functions, including cryptonomy furthering or reversing objection. The horror's complicit cryptonomy is one soldiering against itself, a dialectical material gradient that, from Federici and Creed to me, comments on the usual policing and different forms of police violence, cannibalizing token elements the Medusa must reclaim through her worshippers, i.e. on the same stages, revolutionary cryptonomy using the same language of show and conceal that fascism does, to make the whore into an abject guerrilla who has her own duality to consider. To that, cops are undercover, as Samus is, but so are all whores, a process of concealment and code that Jill Smith, probably unaware of cryptonomy and abjection, still calls a whore's ball, re. the 1988 Hydra event in West Berlin, a place that defies expectations, but specifically what whores should look like, re. not like whores, but gentrified in ways that would argue that historically decay into the very monsters capital cages and kettles mid-abjection. What do you think the Crooked Cross was? A censor merging corporation and state to bottle Pandora by gagging her and slicing off her head. Abjection from the start. Intent doesn't matter. Outcomes do. Source: D.J. Hewitt's 17 Reasons Why Germany's Weimar Republic was a Party Lover's Paradise. The fact remains whores can be cops, including false rebels of the fascist sort. They can also be functional rebels of a proletarian sort, moving power anisotropically towards workers and away from the state. Re. Flow of power determines function, not aesthetics, abjection a two-way street. Sir Will Smith writes about disrupting discussions of prostitutes, moving them away from sexual deviancy and destitution, choosing to focus on assimilation via bourgeois prostitutes she calls, among other things, coquettes. The fact remains that queer folk and other minorities don't have the luxury of mere segregation. We can look like angels in the streets and act like freaks in the sheets, and having a historical understanding of that exact effect in Berlin, while America operates like the Fourth Reich, remains useful, but I would also stress how cryptonomy affords a reversal of Smith's arguments, freaks in the streets, and angels in the sheets, or just freaks wherever. Not only that, consensual nudity disrupts compelled clothing as much as compelled exposure, but also views about things being whore-like for abjection purposes, i.e. nudity is simply a tool for opposing aims, insofar as workers challenging the state as a police structure goes. Smith can talk about clothed stealth whores till the cows come home, but sooner or later an actual collective, visible stance must be taken against capital, which Weimar didn't do nearly enough to stop fascism. I would argue raw nudity works just as well in that respect. Furthermore, Amazonomachia is half real, so can we use the language of monsters like code and disguise to change hearts and minds thus abjection, i.e. doing so versus abandonment, like Smith did in 2013. Her study of Berlin's liminalities, while certainly fascinating and obscure from a purely historical perspective, feels a tad myopic and exclusionary, as third-wave feminism does, albeit to a lesser extent than second-wave, i.e. by focusing on bourgeois whores who are female, cis, and white, but also clothed and ostensibly polite versus not. Tone police much? Your prescription historically serves to pacify labor before it is killed. R.E. Hitler. In short, when Berlin's battleground returns, like a flying castle, to the dialogues of scholarship and imagination, I find myself recalling Hogel's response to Punter's The Literature of Terror, a history of Gothic fictions from 1765 to the present day, 1980. Quote, in the Gothic from the later 18th century on, as David Punter has shown, the middle class often does what we have just seen Leroux do in Le Fantôme. It displaces the hidden violence of present social structures, conjures them up again as past, and falls promptly under their spell, with feelings of both fear and attraction towards the phantasms of what is displaced. The Gothic, well before Leroux adopts it, enables a growing bourgeois hegemony to be both haunted by and distanced from the hidden barbarities that have helped make it possible, and hence the repressed uncertainties it feels about its own legitimacy, as in Abraham's Phantom, by projecting such anomalies into the horrors of apparently old and alien specters, buildings, and crypt. Source: The Ghost of the Counterfeit, Leroux's Phantom, and the Cultural Work of the Gothic, 2002. And yet, alongside the heart-stopping power of ghosts and tombs, we find the Amazonian tomb raiders of Metroidvania, a caught between not just Hogel's Counterfeit and its ghost mid-abjection, but Smith's fixation with whores, re, that don't look like whores, meaning monsters to abject. Any refusal, or even neglect in that area contributes to the usual voids, i.e. those attached umbilically to punitive cultural signifiers that whores are known for, and reach towards the usual panickers out of an imaginary past loaded with actual genocide. Hugs from the numinous patchwork, echoing Geiger's xenomorph. The fact remains, where there's smoke, there's fire, and the earliest book burnings from 1930s Germany, the Weimar graveyard from there on out, sought to purify all capital's decadence in ways no one survived unscathed. We must rise from the ashes, not bury ourselves, but during live burial as a liminal proposition, i.e. through capital's looping historical material brutalities and cryptonyms, as horrors are again classically relegated to ancient graveyards, R.E. Me vis-a-vis Sedgwick's 1980 coherence of Gothic fictions, and B.B. Wagner's 2020 exploration of graveyard prostitution, from Rome to Rome. My point in Gothic versus those allergic to it, R.E. Smith, is that class, culture, and race rely on a wardrobe of concealment and advertisement, i.e. cryptonomy's double operation, R.E. Hogel, that in my mind must subvert and weaponize whatever we can to dismantle capital at home, where home actually is, or how it manifests, mid-abjection, R.E. Metroidvania as the danger disco, its own whore's ball that embraces the flexibility of a given whore's clothing and bodily expression to include public nudism as monstrous, naked, and wildly free. Home is monstrous, and whores are monsters who can look ladylike or not. The holistic nature of my work prefers a spectrum of representation and intersectional solidarized performance versus one select group, endlessly poured over, or Coquettes. For me, that's what Metroidvania are, a brothel of ass warfare, one cursed from undeath rising from the grave, thoroughly allergic to de facto value judgments like Smith's curious knowledge gap, and penchant for disregarding ancient things. Footnote number 3. No oubliette can hold secrets forever, essentially leaking them like hysterical vapors and toxic waste, once the seals fail, R.A. Toxic Schlock Syndrome, and dead whores do tell tales, R.A. from Volume 1. The Western world is generally a place that testifies to its own traumas by fabricating them, i.e. as markers of sovereignty that remain historically unkind to specific groups that nevertheless survive within them as ghosts of unspeakable events linked to systemic abuse. Trauma, in turn, survives through stories corrupted by the presence of said abuse. There is a home resembling a castle, where a ghost, often of a woman, lurks inside, having been met with a sorry fate. But undeath is something that can be felt through echoes of ourselves that aren't diegetically spectral. They feel spectral through an uncanny resemblance, extending over our own graves. This becomes something to play with, akin to an, at times, humorous, even trashy gallows theater rife with dark forbidden language, sin, vice, violence, sex, all-around death, and other taboo subjects discouraged by privileged and unimaginative moderates who historically framed the Gothic as a puerile, good-for-nothing backwater while simultaneously suffering from conservative delusions of privilege and or tokenism. R.E. Jameson. In other words, the pedagogy of the oppressed faces its classic foil, tone policing. Source: Healing from Rape. What applies to Jameson applies to any moderate, including Smith. Footnote number 4, and penchant for disregarding ancient things. Developing communism requires using pre-capitalist ideas to push towards post-scarcity and horizontal, stateless, classless, moneyless positions of power. The position of the ancients, the wisdom of the ancients, a thing to recultivate, by workers punching up, by subverting the very taboos Smith discards with prejudice. Taboos aren't, unto themselves, harmful insofar as we must use them to reclaim our humanity along the same us versus them dialogues. Whores are monsters, proletarian whores, doubly so. Instead of the usual reindeer games, Smith gushes about Berlin and its bourgeois whores who look normal, i.e. not like whores. I see Heron respond much the same way I did when learning about Marx's homophobia in 2024 or Magnus Hirschfeld's devaluing of androgynes in 2025. Quote, by the fin de siècle, the androgyne was perceived as a monster of sexual and moral ambiguity, often identified with other outsiders such as masochists, sadists, homosexuals, and lesbians. Eventually, even Magnus Hirschfeld, the sexologist who defended male homosexuals, lesbians, and transvestites, condemned the androgyne for its supposed lack of harmony. Greeks and Romans had thought androgynes beautiful, but modern scientists could no longer agree. They were now perceived as misshapen freaks. True, there were those who tried to revive the older image of the androgyne as a symbol of perfect harmony in order to defend homosexuals. For them, the tender youth with girlish body and male genitals provided a corrective to aggressively masculine symbols of power, but in general the distinction between normal and abnormal held, and the androgyne as a biological monster was allowed no happy ending. Respectability had to be fortified to resist the onslaught of those who were rediscovering their bodies and attacking dominant manners and morals. Unquote. Source: Nationalism and Sexuality. The crux for this regression is always bourgeois, and bourgeois is the very adjective Smith assigns, i.e. to her object of study, whores, while alienating her readers from the very alien things demanding reclamation, also whores, are nudity and whorish, monstrous feminine signifiers, the question asked by hydrous whores, though somewhat tongue-in-cheek, still capitalist realist in my opinion. Respectability is a charnel house, one in which the very coquettes from Smith's research were buried alive. Silence is genocide, which we must camp by giving voice to the unspeakable, in a world where all workers are whores under capital, albeit to different degrees and flavors of exploitation. R.E. My Thesis Statement, 2023. Kill your darlings, you have only to lose your chains. So often this outcry involves nude monsters, which whores generally are. While discretion can be the better part of valor concerning liberation, covering up entirely is foolish, as it ostracizes the already vulnerable, i.e. for respectability and profit, which furthers objection by doing fascism's work for it, closeting the whore. In effect, the work of the very liberal sorts who helped fascism rise to power on either side of the Atlantic, from Non-Compete's 2025, Third Wayism and the Liberal Fascist Bargain, which I read at the hospital between Smith's Coquette. Quote, as for Sellers, he is repeating the same mistakes which many preceding liberals have made, the hubristic notion that fascism is a force which can be controlled through shrewd political maneuvering, on par with Smith's Coquette's flirting with fascism, which, in case anyone forgot, led to the entire city's destruction. This self-deception which liberals fall into, leading them to believe that they can manage fascism, has led to the downfall of many a liberal democracy. History provides numerous precedents where liberals enabled and empowered fascists under the mistaken belief that such brutal political currents could be contained. It happened in Italy, leading to the fascist domination of Benito Mussolini and Italy's ruin. It happened in Weimar Germany, leading up to the Third Reich and Germany's downfall. It happened with Pinochet, who was backed by Chilean liberal centrists, resulting in decades of strife for that nation. Again and again throughout history, liberals have thought they could manipulate and maintain control over fascists, and time again this has led to strife, chaos, and ruin. As stated before, this dangerous tendency often surfaces precisely when working-class consciousness begins to challenge the hegemony of bourgeois liberalism. The mere consideration of extending an olive branch to a fascist figure like Musk signals deep-seated opportunism, which has historically been quite ruinous to liberal parties. The lesson from history is undeniable. Fascism must be opposed uncompromisingly. Those who would befriend fascists, whether through explicit alliances or opportunistic political maneuvering, must be resisted as strenuously as the fascists themselves, lest history's greatest calamities be repeated. It is an unfortunate fact that bourgeois liberals do not ultimately seek to build a world free of oppression, for all their pretty words. Rather, they cling to the capitalist political economy, which is built upon class division, that brutalizes and dominates the majority of humanity. Fascism and liberalism are distinct ideologies with distinct political programs and institutions. They are not one and the same. They emerge from different material conditions, and they serve different factions of the ruling class, who have conflicting views about how best to rule over the workers of the world. But in terms of function, they are one and the same. Both exist to serve and defend capital." Unquote. And in regarding that, do you really think there's any kind of place for Smith's bourgeois Coquette and fascism's American revival? We're in quite the pickle, one enforced historically by women against their own kind, but also other marginalized groups that pimp themselves out of convenience and desperation. Resistance must become, as it were, naked. This voice through nudity itself is monstrously cloaked and bare at the same time. R.E., when the man comes around, show him your aegis. This includes token servants of capital gentrifying whores, whose worrying lack of nudity needs to be addressed by our own weaponizing of state monopolies thereof. R.E., by putting the pussy on the chain wax, or the sass in the ass below. The solution is communism, non-compete rights, and their own substack. I would agree, albeit with a focus on the nude body language of whore as monster that Smith appears to abstain from. We're at the point where arguing about intent, or to matters of degree, doesn't really matter. Fascism is here, and whores of all kinds will, like Samus in her suit of armor, be used to cage and betray their own class interests, alongside cultural and racial ones that profit only abuses for itself mid-abjection. The fact remains Medusa's powers can reverse abjection, thus profit, but they won't work if she's forced to wear sunglasses, but also any clothing of a politer sort against her will. Respectability politics are merely a debate with capital's usual mercenaries, one where no one wins but the richest of the rich, the mesdames and the pimps. But more than anyone, the usual victims are the very people who need to weaponize their bodies and nudity of said bodies to serve worker needs over state needs. Those who look like whores, insofar as looks like really means deviance and destitution, i.e. per Smith's own arguments furthering abjection, itself meaning anyone capital assigns that unhappy status to, e.g. people of color, religious minorities, women, GNC or indigenous persons, etc., as workers forced to fight for scraps while dividing themselves, as usual. How about we seize the means of production for all workers instead? Communism fucks away from omelets. So enough with the veiled Red Scare tactics. Make Marx gay and naked. Unsheathe your swords, even if the metaphor is admittedly mixed, the weaponry of one's booty or thighs, above and below, having militant class war qualities to them. Rebellion should be hungry and loud, for there's no other way that abjection reverses, or as Creed showed in 1993, horrors rule through terror, shock, and awe, and have since ancient times, as weapons of fear about military force and sexual violence that workers can subvert, thus reclaim for various aims in the sack or out, e.g. anal sex, re. our sweet revenge. Whether they mean to or not, a desire for silence historically leads white middle-class women to punch down against what they associate with trauma, i.e., blaming the whore. So while Smith herself doesn't quite argue, I just hate those obvi whores and whores who aren't authentic Berliners and or women, I cannot help but note a perceived lack of whores in her scholarship beyond woman, i.e. as suspiciously white, cis, European, middle-class, and clothed, e.g. her fourth and final chapter, Working Girls, White-Collar Workers and Prostitutes in Late Weimar Fiction. Footnote number 5. This feels exclusionary and redundant, i.e. as prostitutes are workers and sex work is work. It feels notably regressive, regardless of intent, a swarthy attitude harkening nostalgically back, slumming style, as much to Beauvoir's Woman is Other as to Edward Said noting, with some justice, the distinct lack or absence of any concrete mention of slavery in Mansfield Park. Whores are agents of destruction, Smith, and suggesting we avoid that dichotomy as something that irrefutably exists in modern times is, I would argue, sheer folly begot from privilege defending Omelis. Those who survived Weimar often came from luxury, but also privilege, turning a blind eye to wider sufferings taking place in the shadow of state force, thus tokenization. So many sex workers can afford luxuries like feting fancy balls with their clothes on. E.g., Mugi is a trans man who has to eat just like cis women do. Instead, they show their bellies, on which the code is just as much the dialectical material context of exchange, itself changing the direction power flows versus pure aesthetics alone. A rebellious whore is basically a pirate, then, one whose wealth redistributes through their bodies, survival sex work hybridizing victim and villain, turning into monstrous feminine survivors of capital by transforming it through trade. Rejecting the monstrous whore of the street while embracing the bourgeois whore in their place is not entirely Smith's argument. Indeed, she condemns fixating on that tired binary and nothing else to justify her work, similar to Frederick Jameson. See Alex Link's The Mysteries of Postmodernism or Frederick Jameson's Gothic plots. But there is something of a critical blind spot in her statements, and a dismissal of Gothic if only one made through preference for the classier sort of gentrified whores who hide the ages versus using it, re. her emphasis on Berliner bourgeois cocottes, and I thought I was myopic. While admittedly interesting to learn about as Smith's research topic, whores don't reduce to women or female at all, a fact that should be kept in mind when studying those admitted by Smith, but also Hirschfeld, Creed, Freud, and countless other scholars. We must enlarge their minds, or their survivors' minds, to other realities besides clothed, unclothed, with print academics like Smith prone to kissing the asses of their publishers. Her acknowledgments, which conclude with, I am grateful to the respective presses for their permission to reprint this material. Footnote number 6, about whores not reducing to women or female at all, e.g. male whores from non-Western countries, RE from Volume 3, Exhibit 87E1, left, source and model, glasses, GF, right, model, glasses, GF. And Gothic whores are monsters. Catherine McKinnon writes, sexual objectification is the primary process of the subjection of women. It unites act with word, construction with expression, perception with enforcement, myth with reality, man fucks woman, subject, verb, object. However, in a gender analysis of global sex work from selling sex in the city, a global history of prostitution, 1600s to 2000s, Elise van Niederveen Merkirk writes, while most of the chapters do not provide much information about male or transgender transvestite sex work, and in most historical legal contexts prostitution has been defined as female, some countries such as China and the Ottoman Empire had a rich tradition of prostitution by men or boys. In other words, much of sex work is historically AFAB since ancient times, but includes AMABs from as far back who are treated in a traditionally feminine sense under the current colonial model, whose exploitation under capitalism we will examine in Chapter 3 when we cover discrimination against femboys, traps, and swings, and the patriarchal hatred against transgender persons, intersexuality, and drag section. Regardless of sex or gender, all sex workers are heteronormatively slighted to varying degrees. Among them, men expect women are beings forced to identify and perform as women, to labor in various ways that appeal to cishet men as the universal clientele under capitalism. These expectations objectify women for said gays, but also treat them like disposable garbage. Source: Selling Sex Worfs and Underpaid Sex Work. As my work shows, we must build better temples, regardless if the holders of the kingdom keys sanction us, i.e., in light of encroaching fascism, which demands a willingness to play with all aspects of a castle, and not just the parts that fancy us. Whores aren't just cocottes. There is always another castle, and the usual fascist fortresses, coming back a century after Weimar, aim to cannibalize the usual victims of state treachery that whores embody. Silence is genocide, and covering nudity up silences nudity. Total clothing is total silence, which will not benefit us. Should America itself go rabid, we must fight back in the shadow of such forces, acclimating to objection as something to reverse through naked monstrosity versus tokenizing to gatekeep the in-group mid-Holocaust. Ari, quote, "When such a castle appears, it is time to be afraid. The colonial harvest is at hand, yet precisely because the state does not hold a monopoly over violence, terror, and morphological expression, a demon or castle needn't spell our end. It can represent our sole means of attack, reclaiming said poetic's endless inventiveness to turn colonizer fears back into their hopelessly scared brains." Unquote. Source: Praise Liberators. So is the whore's nude body and monstrous poetics a castle-like weapon, i.e., whose power must be reclaimed mid-crisis, not abandoned. When the state condemns your home as alien, you must fight for it using what you got. During the dialectic of the alien, we must not simply regard such things, but hug them as powerful tools to reverse abjection, thus profit. There is no one use for the appearance of whore, as Smith argues. Nudity for the Amazon is a weapon to speak out with, i.e., regardless of the genders involved. Silence is death as a thing to camp through darkness visible, e.g. rape in quotes, but also destroyer and victim language overlapping on said bodies. Re, we camp canon because we must, which requires calculated risk, especially the fear of imprisonment, the kept woman, through little gothic BDSM. Infinite power in ways we shouldn't cover up, but speak out with regarding those who see us only to shriek, witch, whore, criminal, rube, and so on. From a dialectical material standpoint, the oldest profession bears the brunt of the oldest exploitation, i.e. surviving into the present. Medusa was a rape victim, R.E. Hadley, and whores are garbage that work with garbage to humanize themselves, R.E. Hot allostatic load. The problem isn't that we're monsters, but that monsters are dehumanized by capital. R.E. Nature is food. However, just as no limit for profit exists, there is no limit for labor value through nudity and gender expression. For example, Hallie Cross is a soft pleasure dom with gender-fluid components, i.e. as someone who is literally one of my project muses, a gorilla who fights their battles behind the safety of a phone screen taken inside one's home, or a public bathroom stall above, and whose de facto education challenges state corporate dogma, such as revolutionary cryptonomy versus complicit during objections tug-of-war. Class war is ass war, as extending to minorities of many different kinds, i.e. a polity of speech, consciousness versus not, e.g. disabled people, people of color, and or non-white bodies shapelier and wilder than is normally allowed, above. Likewise, many sex workers are ace in ways that go beyond Smith's clothed, respectable whores, yet despite this purity test, I've come to see many stone-cold sluts enjoying their work anyways, getting down to business while taking pride in their nude aspects. To exclude all of that for a myopic historical fascination isn't novel, it's puritanical, dumb, and practically inert, and rebellion requires devotion to greater powers than the bourgeoisie. Medusa will win in the end, re state shift. We might as well avoid total annihilation if we can help it, climate change. So when Smith writes, an institution that promotes sexual relations with emotional attachment, prostitution detaches love from sex, I want to ask them if they actually know what a prostitute is, or rather, for them to expand their definition to something that includes the likes of me and my friends, loving the work we do together, e.g. Bunny and I, next page, re having the whore's revenge against profit, nakedly as whores who get a great many things out of sex for money, often through public nudism, but also sales of nudism we love to exhibit. Furthermore, when facing death, the reality of sex work and intimacy is that death, including death in quotes or perceptions thereof, is an aphrodisiac, general euphoric device dressed up in the language of the hunt, cherchez la femme, i.e. the dose makes the poison, the Gothic forcing the privilege to lick on a dark half that literally stops their heart. When describing my condition to a fellow sex worker, they replied how they too had a bum ticker, specifically an extra heartbeat. In turn, heroes in classic myth are flawed, usually to fatal extremes, having one foot in hell, e.g. Achilles, Hippolyta, or Persephone. All heroes are monsters, and all whores are monsters with heroic potential to expose monstrous things to reclaim them mid-paradox, which abjection is. Censorship is silence, and covering things up only demands an apocalypse. From us, speaking out, as segregation is no defense. Remind fascism just how charmed a life it's led. Show them their dark, chaotic side on the aegis, inviting terror as a paralytic, mind-altering device. In other words, a desire to keep quiet and hide will not serve us. The moment we cover ourselves to flirt with Nazis being precisely the moment we surrender our power to our enemies, telling us our own limits. If you don't believe me, consider the silence of modern-day YouTuber trans coquettes like ContraPoints or Philosophy Tube, i.e. people with privilege betray out of convenience, those with oppression betray out of desperation, and people with both betray out of convenience and desperation, e.g. white trans women needing to check their privilege despite their oppression. The closet is a slow-acting guillotine, i.e. just the thought of sex is enough to get people censored, a thought crime in the flesh. And that is what we must uncover through the joy of reclamation, under fascism hunting us. We're not omitting anyone. We also won't cover up to play nice. Joy under fascism. Capital decays into fascism. Under fascism, there must always be a whore to rape, including flirty maidens the state will rape regardless, and call whore and good girl all at once. As Amazons classically show, domesticization is death. Smith's whores were too servile to effectively push back collectively with other minorities against fascism, a mistake present whores must avoid in order to joyously survive to mock our pimps. Medusa, beheaded, laughs back in her conquerors' faces. Can't touch this, she jeers, topping from below, the OG power bottom, A while finding love, despite her scars, to change shape as we require. For lack of a better term, it's joy under fascism, and optimism in knowing they can't exterminate us in bad faith, and furthermore that we can fight back and enjoy ourselves, i.e. doing so while using the same stages in good faith, e.g. Metroidvania, or that which Metroidvania allude to, the corpse of empire. Indeed, we feel most alive while doing so, the Gothic paradox of vicarious danger speaking to half-real varieties in poetic haunted house ways, i.e. chasing such things down and harnessing their power for ourselves. Sex has power because the state tries to control it, the fire in our godly breasts and backsides, to work at revolution with. The apologia is not of rape, but rape in quotes, so make it weird in healthy ways. Remind fascists that even if they kill us, we're still cooler than they are. Think Dracula dead and loving it, but whores acting nakedly monstrous through their cryptonomy, doing communism to reverse abjection. Nudity isn't bodies alone, but frank expressions of feelings that nude expressions of whoring play a part in, with Bunny and I being platonic friends, working on the same book series. Hey love, about to do that set for you, just wanted to keep you updated. I hope you're having a good weekend as well. You've really helped shape my way of thinking, especially about aceness and public nudism, Bun Bun. I love you very much, my friend. I'm thinking about you and wishing you nothing but the very best, ever and always. I love you and care about you so much. Thank you for everything that you do, and I can't wait to see everything you come up with. Not a death sentence when the chickens come home to roost, but a new lease on life. Capital frames nudity and clothing verging on nude as alien, thus where its power lies, the latter to transform the former through labor as nude, including newly negotiated. Capital makes us alien, giving us a tremendous bar to leverage them with. The very language of fearful sex and force, but also commerce, is animalistic, in ways capital has isolated the elite and their servants from. The doomsday of a colony literally gone to seed. Ari, Mother Brain, a vice character, let out to seek Mother Nature's revenge. Development burns Rome over time, not all at once. We must make fascism gay, which is to say, not fascism, by reclaiming what it steals and abuses in bad faith. To develop Gothic communism with using the Gorgon, the Amazon, and similar animal medicalized beings' call of the wild, void, hell, what have you, is scaring fascism to death for being so insulated by capital, shielded from what it fears to a numinous degree, a dire, supernaturally pagan revenge seeming, though not really, not of this earth. R.E. Grendel's mother, but also GNC echoes of such mothers and their fat dumpers below. The doors of Asprey's counterterror opened by us for a change, and throughout history per Asprey's book, exposure becomes joy through a means of fighting back. R.E. on the Aegis. Regarding GNC echoes of such mothers and their fat dumpers, R.E. the non-white body explored in ways pornographic stereotypes having their own racialized flavor, which you can very well explore with your clothes on. And yet, paradox plays into what we choose to show and conceal to varying degrees of undress and illusion, i.e. darkness visible. To disrobe is disease control in ways canon teaches, but workers camp, all with an essence of speed and caution that go hand in hand, as workers born into a world made to exploit us, and one that can only change if we take matters into our own hands, at whatever speed we need to. Our aim should be explicit, regardless if our art is legally obscene or not, subject to change, with Project 2025 and intermittent laws, e.g., FSC versus Paxton. Such flagrancy is ultimately a question of moderation, not moderacy, i.e. when society calls us poison, poison is the cure. Just how denying ourselves water is to die of thirst, to deny ourselves a particular branch of information or technology is to make ourselves terminally ignorant, susceptible. Evolution is messy and crude, and exercising crude power for ourselves, we must camp our own holocaust, rape, and profound survival, i.e. finding similarity amid difference, ergo intersectional solidarity through paradoxical means. Nudity is a vector of exchange, including rebellious exchange. It's a positivity we find by making it among friends while fighting back to liberate all workers all at once. Always punch up at fascism, including those who defend it, with fascism the word not even making the index in Smith's book. That is what Little Gothic BDSM does, challenging profit through rape play, camping capital's Cartesian desire, therefore genocide through the whore's revenge, paradox of whores and rape, i.e. rape reprise, and concerning rape play, i.e. to penetrate nature and torture her secrets out from an increasingly dark womb feared as extended, alien, and unknown by thinking beings. Quote, European civilization, or we, in Descartes' word, must become the masters and possessors of nature. Society and nature were not just existentially separate. Nature was something to be controlled and dominated by society. The Cartesian outlook, in other words, shaped modern logics of power as well as thought. Unquote. A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. The paradoxical idea is to reverse the above hold on things, i.e. by projecting ourselves onto things the state normally sees as safe, thus will attack when confused. By exposing itself through accidental confessions mid-pareidolia, the whore in the house, making the nuclear model melt inside people's panic-stricken brains. In other words, ass war is asymmetrical. Two warring confederacies, Medusa and her ilk, fight the state as things to embody in small, but also in speed as capital decays, fearing nature more and more, embodied by workers who, classified as terrorists, will have to rely on this sinful status to survive state abuse. Through a steady and increasing pull, its emergent strategies of deception and craft, e.g. songs, dances, theater, and other oral written traditions, often surrounding food, pain, fighting, and fertility myths, cut from the same cloth as our executioners' pirate hoods. These are very old fears, and useful for that reason alone, Smith, i.e. the more fascism fears us, per moral panic, the more power we have as capital speeds up. The more it speeds up, the more we use their fear against them, as routinely happens in Metroidvania, i.e. she fucks back. Whores are historically chattelized, alien stewards of nature who defend nature, i.e. as something to point towards doomsayers harming the planet, honesty a means of practice to armored exposure, the usual buffers, e.g. phone screens. To that, an essence of station and speed also go hand in hand. To feel the rush of excitement when making friends to unite under a larger cause, and to realize that while time is of the essence, there's still time to take time back through these labors speed-running communism mid-death race. The paradox is doing that at full speed, i.e. doing what's required, resting and relaxing as needed. For workers are not born simply to work. As we prepare the measure of our day's labor and repose, we arm forbear during the usual struggles at full speed, to meet our enemies on the streets of imagination, including their graveyards as things to happily race through, on chariots of the gods, following the footsteps of older trailblazers we love and respect, e.g. Mike Jitlov for me, below. i.e. the motion and the freight, but also the camouflage. A better world will come, but we have to visibly fight for it, not by running away from fascism when it arrives, but towards danger as something to subvert on the aegis, not exactly Stalin's infamous, not one step back order, but certainly having a similar level of determination. Ass is where I belong to. I won't give you the ass, Sora the troll when Japanese voice actor pronounces the earth. Whores love paradox, homeless included. They also command respect and communicate as Gothic castles do, i.e. through motion in stillness, an opaque place of instability that begets ergodic motion, therefore revelation, once inside, re Bakhtin's chronotope, but also castles in the flesh, tied concentrically to larger alien containers with a human stamp, and vice versa. What form the whore takes will belong to the past, as partly imaginary, thus playful. The past is not only imperfect when exposed, but reinvented in Gothic ways that allow for useful reinvention provided play allows for open communication, i.e. during Little Gothic BDSM's expanded domains of play that take what is useful from historically albeit limited contributions like Smith, but also critique them similar to Hirschfeld or hell, even Scotty C.W., re Nature versus the State. Conclusion. To conclude, and a couple closing points, 3 pages, we must play with whores as endemic to castles, learning to tell the difference when whores of different kinds look alike, the Nazi reviving an abusive medieval versus our own Gothic communism celebrating the very liberation of those whores that Smith and her bourgeois cocottes arguably turned a blind eye to, what Jameson would call blank parody, or a statue with blind eyeballs. We must become nude in ways that protect us aprotropaically from attackers, to freeze them in place, and give us our voice, as long with anger inside it, but also wild frenzy and unfettered joy. Indeed, it's an ode to joy that convulses Keats' plaintive nightingale with a darker side, re psychosexual martyrdom, e.g. Ku and I below, embodying such things as lessons to pass on to future workers, expressing joy in our own power to reclaim our labor, therefore humanity, while being remembered for the struggle, playing with fire stolen back from the gods. Being queer isn't a curse, nor are we useless eaters. We're taonga, forming pockets of resistance, inspiring ourselves to shared joy under fascism. Footpoint number 8, meaning treasure, from Maori, e.g. Dr. Huhana Hickey's pledge. This Matariki, Dr. Huhana Hickey, is calling for a return to pre-colonial understandings of disability, where people are seen as taonga. Her vision for the future is one of growth, advocacy, and healing, where every whānau member is valued. Liberation is phenomenological as anything final or complete. Universality, an attempt by workers to diversify towards liberation. It's an uphill battle, but a worthwhile one. Its development arriving in stages and phases, not totality all at once. There's bound to be setbacks, heartbreak, and disappointment among the breakthroughs. Keep pushing and demystify state veils. Find joy by liberating parts of yourself while being oppressed. Break all monopolies, sex or otherwise. Survive through joy. Progress requires struggle, said Frederick Douglass. To closet ourselves in clothes is to functionally grow limp, devoid of struggle, through clothes and situational disguise. though clothes and situational disguise are obviously necessary if and when fascism crystallizes. Tokenization is limp, selling out for Judas Gold, RE ContraPoints being a liberal Zionist apologizing for genocide. If we're only not careful, but not brave, which tokens aren't, cocottes or otherwise, the death of the Weimar Republic will repeat at home versus overseas with Palestine. Nudity is courage, and abstinence doesn't work. Reclaim what terrifies the state. Medusa uncloaked and uncorked. Something whose pussy is slain, in quotes, taking power back for ourselves. T for T, if only by realizing we have value as is. Of course, Smith isn't completely wrong. Berlin was and is a liminal space, one haunted by sex and force, with militant Germanic fractals censored by World War, destruction of the colony, but also the satellite state. A similar blind spot exists within Metroidvania, the cure for said blindness existing inside not just spaces of play, but a willingness to hug the alien inside, outside, for its alien status is paradoxically liberatory versus canonical varieties punching down, the battle for universal liberation happening on stage and off. This requires nudity to work, because rebellion is always, to some degree, naked and monstrously violent, though cryptonomy allows for nudity while clothed, R.E. Sedgwick's imagery of the surface. The heralds of capital's demise, the moment we free ourselves, not before. The state is straight. We fags must feed to survive, sucking the state dry of our own blood. Repress this, assholes. Where was that arrow fired from? And lastly, the whore's revenge, therefore escape by transforming the home, while paradoxically inside it, includes by touching hearts and minds, in ways that veer into literal camp, farce being the second outcome when history repeats. And camping the canon historically takes medieval language to camp whores for the benefit of workers and nature, e.g. Monty Python borrowing from Shakespeare, but also Chaucer to say some fairly Marxist things. Whatever said, revolution is perennial, and whores must look like whores at least part of the time, i.e. because that is how you reverse abjection, by playing with the alien to humanize it, when nothing more alien, thus divided and policed by capital and sex, and generally dressed up in the language of war is camp. Anything else is a band-aid for a bullet, fascism fired from capital and speeding towards us. Find joy in fighting it, reversing abjection through the cryptonomy process, on the aegis. Like any good horror, rebellion is sneaky, funny, and crude, but also educated in ways both of the school and the street. It's our job to survive by not being fooled by illusions while using ours against our would-be puppeteers. Show them no quarter. Make 'em beg. Regarding footnote number 9, transforming the home while paradoxically inside it, RE from Volume 2, capitalism must be escaped from within, but also with the help of those who inspire us. Escape for workers isn't to bury our heads in the sand, but enter authored sites of paradox, dens of confusion, the infernal concentric pattern, to play with cryptonomy as deliberately leading to healing of the home as sick with capitalism. To that, sometimes the quickest path to escape development, the maze, isn't a straight line, but an ergodic, nonlinear one that eventually, over many lifetimes and lives, leads to the exit, a condition of systemic healing inside the home, as stuck within the maze, something to renovate and allude to better and better versions thereof, not destroy or banish like a nightmare. Better yet, make it a dalliance. A dance with death that leaves fascism visibly gasping for air. Exploitation and liberation share the same stage, so give them a heart attack, your aegis the fabled means of doing so, arresting the very arterial mechanisms that genocide all workers at different speeds, the striptease versus skipping the foreplay outright, cutting to the chase. Fascism rules through fear, to blacken our hearts until we lose the will to live, let alone fight. Reclaiming said darkness helps workers not only survive, but solidarize and speak out to itself as subversively Amazonian or Gorgonesque, the alien survivor thriving in spite of state actors chasing her. The hunt is half real, but goes both ways. We have what they want, which we can deny them, outstaying their welcome, while enjoying ourselves. Look, don't touch. The aegis is a shield, door, and weapon, depending on who's using it. Context matters, nudity a powerful teaching device. Capital's historical refrain is torment for profit, i.e. capital is a bona fide torment nexus whose historical material trauma turns people into cops or victims, but also survivors. The trick is being a survivor who meets other survivors through performative code they communicate as comrades do. As danger to perform, theatrical danger, without leading fascism, actual danger into safe spaces. Good actors root out bad actors before infiltration by imitation occurs, grossing them out or scaring and or pissing them off, nails on a chalkboard, so they drop the mask, i.e. while we're having fun, feeding our appetites to the fullest, find people with mana, then play keep away from the Nazis. Survival is criminal, but it needn't be harmful provided we keep the cops at bay. The thing workers have in common that's important to all of them in different ways, re, a pedagogy of the oppressed achieved through similarity amid difference, separating the wheat from the chaff, and that isn't hard to do. Fascism fears everything and feels constantly bitter about its own self-loathing rules, i.e. they're miserable, which we can remind them of constantly while eluding their toxic traps. Think Jerry the Mouse from the old cartoon. They're not gods, but sad, angry dorks workers can humiliate by existing in spite of them, valuing consent, the ability to negotiate, as Nazi kryptonite. They call us weak, yet stare and tremble. Regarding, footnote number 10, the trick being a survivor who meets other survivors through performative code. E.g., the porn trope of needing one's sofa moved. Monsters are a similar kind of code, of which there's endless variation and social cues to convey whenever we need. Regarding mana, the meaning of mana. There are more cautionary notes in Maoridom dealing with mana than you could shake the proverbial stick at. It is a source of both personal and collective strength, pride, and identity. Mishandled, it becomes the bearer of shame, ridicule, and embarrassment. If mana allows us to walk tall, then it also casts a long shadow, humility. To write about mana can be likened to picking blackberries. That's not a job for the barefooted. The fruit is sweet but fragile. And don't upset your neighbor. Stick to your own patch. In other words, draw on your experiences, not those of others. Chris Winatana, journalist and student of Maori Taonga, is a blackberry picker from way back. And you can read the rest of this yourself if you want to see more of what they have to say. But essentially, mana is a sense of cultural value, of importance, of social significance. It's something that can be collected, accrued, and performed through activism, which is something that the Maori culture has had to invoke in light of being replaced by their own colonizers, but also fearing assimilation. Ari, kill the Indian, save the man. Same idea, kill the Maori, save the person. So, to prevent that replacement from happening, Maori draw upon mana to survive. And not just people I know, but their entire culture as a way of life. And this is something that we can take as people who are not indigenous and draw upon the same idea to unite with marginalized communities like the Maori to fight back. That's what Joy Under Fascism is. Amazonian code exploring stigmatic tolerances that, when viewed, make our bullies self-destruct and capital transform away from replicating such things. It confuses what workers like, want, and need, often through desperation, but doesn't monopolize such matters. Fantastical thoughts and actions aren't the same. Instead, excitement is anisotropic, its polarity as reversible, i.e. during calculated risk performed by workers with types. Fantasy can flow power vampirically towards horrors, skillfully arbitrating the gothic zones of dark fantasy, on stage and off. So go ham, my hellions, breast, booty, or thighs, whatever the meat, or Metroidvania displaying said meat and the amount of clothes below. Let them bite off more than they can possibly chew. Here comes the airplane. A reference to, in case you're wondering, Lord Churchill. Some people push back on the justice of roosting chickens. In regards to Footnote number 11. Whatever the meat or Metroidvania displaying said meat and the amount of clothes, with such clothes classically being chosen by men, i.e. borrowed robes, the role of chosen clothing, Part 1, female video game characters, but as Smith shows, the same wardrobe policing operates as much through bias towards whores, i.e. as sex objects of academic study. For theater to work as we need, we can't tie our hands behind our back, like Smith does. Public nudism has value, including monstrous feminine forms, i.e. cops and robbers, Amazons and Gorgons. That concludes the essay. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Every little bit helps as far as that goes. You can also leave a comment in the comments section. Constructive criticism is always appreciated, provided, again, it's constructive. Also, again, if you want to support the work I do, you can do it through Ko-fi or Patreon. There are various tiers on Patreon that basically give you extra bonuses and things like that. Ko-fi is a little bit more simple. You can donate however much you want on Ko-fi or however little. On Patreon, you have set amounts. But in any event, that helps a lot. And if you like my content, or dislike it for that matter, feedback again is always welcome. And until next time, I hope you enjoyed this essay of mine. I would recommend reading Smith's book. It is interesting to say the least, and it is far from the worst thing I've read about sex work. It's hardly what I would call swerve, but it's also annoyingly middle of the road at times, and has kind of weird blind spots, as I've hopefully tried to convey. In any event, thank you for attending my essay and this reading, and until next time, stay safe out there, look after each other, and good luck.